Yo, what's good, Spirit Squad? It's your boy Dre, and today we're gonna get to go over an IRL tournament I played this weekend. It's been a really long time since we've had consistent access to any kind of IRL magic, and, well, we did pretty well too, so that's even better. So we played our normal list, Blue-White Spirits. We did a little bit of updates, as always, so what we're gonna do here is actually go over the entire deck list, show off the IRL deck since, well, when was the last time y'all saw that? And then we'll actually go round by round over exactly what happened, how the tournament went. Looking forward to it. Our mana base here is a bunch of just relatively consistent stuff. We've got 4 Sea Chrome Coasts, 4 Hallowed Fountains, 4 Flooded Strands, and then we're playing 3 Cavernous Souls. These will make it so that we have perfect to near perfect colors basically all the time. Almost any 2 lands in this deck will be able to cast either a white 2-drop or a blue 2-drop as needed. We've got 4 basics, 2 each of islands and plains, and these are going to be fetchable with your 4 Flooded Strands, naturally drawing them, or we can play the 1 of Prismatic Vista so that we can make sure to guarantee get a basic. Here I'm playing Prismatic Vista instead of something like a Polluted Delta because we want to make sure that we can either get our basic plains or our basic island as necessary against something that either A, wants to deal us damage so we don't want to fetch shock all the time, or B, is playing Blood Moon and we have a little bit more of an ability to play around that. So with a total of 9 ways to get basics out of your 21 lands here, you know, almost half of our lands help to play around Blood Moon pretty well. That's a place that I generally like to be, especially when we're busy doing all of the attacking and have Aether Vials. However, we also wanted a 21st land in this deck so that we are less likely to see any kind of one-landers. Reason being is that, you know, Prismatic Ending is a card now, so we are less able to rely on Aether Vial to basically get us out of a jam. We are going to need to keep more stable hands, and playing a higher land count makes it so that your hands are more likely to be stable. So for here, we're playing 21 lands, and I don't know that I see that number really changing anytime soon. However, we do get to have that land be Moorland Haunt, and Moorland Haunt, oh my god, this card is so good. It's been good forever. It will continue to be good. If I play a 22nd land in this deck at some point in time, it will be a second Moorland Haunt. Just, it solves a lot of problems. All of the decks that are playing just infinite removal, like Control decks, Grixis Death Shadow, and Jund, you know, they're all trying to play attrition-based games, and when your land can just make you an endless stream of creatures, you know, that plan really fails on their end of things, especially since they already have to work through you, like your Giver of Runes, your Thalias, your Selfless Spirits, your Drog Skull Captains, your Rattle Chains. So they already have to slog through a bunch of removal just to basically play Magic. And if they succeed, then you still get to have Moorland Haunt make more creatures for you. So great times overall, usually for just us. Now that we have seen the lands, let's check out the sideboard. And here in our sideboard, we've got things for a lot of different decks. What we're playing is going to be 3 copies of Core Firewalker, 3 Subtlety, 3 Prismatic Ending, to go along with 2 Lavinia Azorius Renegade, 2 Force Negations, and then 1 each of Mystical Dispute and Skyclave Apparition. This sideboard is trying to solve as many problems as possible because Modern's just a ridiculously wide open format. Specifically in my area, in upstate New York, we find a lot of people who playing Burn. It is a very common deck to see IRL. So we're playing 3 copies of Core Firewalker to help shore up that matchup. There's also going to be a good amount of decks like 4-color Blink, and that's where we see cards like Lavinia to help solve the problems of Fury and Solitude. But also Force Negation helps with Planeswalkers, Mystical Dispute counters basically that entire deck, and then Subtlety solves a lot of problems as well, seeing as most of their good cards are either creatures or Planeswalkers. You'll see a lot of the Solitudes and Furies, well, Subtlety solves those. Subtlety does help with both versions of the Fairy, and if they're playing Jace or anything else, then so be it. We've got a Skyclave Apparition and 3 Prismatic Ending to help with a lot of decks like Hammer Time, like Shadow, like Jund, anything that's trying to kind of creature you back. And then if you're playing something crazy like Tron, for example, we've got a lot of play against that as well. Force Negation, Lavinia, and Subtlety all help out against these really big mana spells. especially since Subtlety and Force Negation can be cast for 0 mana. So if you're falling behind, or if they happen to be on a play and just have a turn 3 Charon, they get to play something huge, you can Force or Subtlety it and then just kind of go about your business without wasting a turn holding up mana for something like, say, Counterspell itself. Everything else is kind of caught by a lot of our catch-all things. Control decks get hit by Mystical Dispute and Force Negation. Miscellaneous creature decks get hit by Skyclave Apparition and Prismatic Ending. And then anything that's kind of off the wall, like, I don't know, say some really crazy combo deck, usually gets hit by some combination of Force Negation or Lavinia. So anything that's like, say, Living End, for example, Lavinia and Force Negation do really well against that. And then Mystical Dispute isn't even bad either, because a lot of their solutions to what you're doing is just like blue cards. So if they're trying to, for example, Brazen Bar away your Lavinia, well, Mystical Dispute solves that problem. They don't get to get Lavinia off the table. They can't cast Living End. Same goes for Rhinos. We've got Force Negation, Lavinia, Mystical Dispute against that. And then if you're feeling really unsafe, Prismatic Ending can kill a Rhino too. Lots and lots of ways to solve problems. And while there's no such thing as a perfect 15 card sideboard for a format as wide open as Modern, I think this is pretty serviceable for the decks that I expected to play against. Yo, bands make a dance. Bands make a dance. No, seriously, we got band updates. So the biggest one, I think, or at least the biggest one that's relevant to my life since I don't really play Arena anymore, is going to be that Ragavan got banned in Legacy. So that's super hype. Blue-Red Delver's been the best deck in the format for a really long time, and there was no signs of it slowing down. It even won one of the Eternal Weekend events. So seeing that banned from Legacy is huge game. And honestly, like, anybody who's talking about like, well, that's going to shift the format a bunch, and it's really not. Yeah, Blue-Red Delver has been the best deck in Legacy for years. It is still going to be the best deck after Rags. They're literally just going to go right back to playing Delver. You'll still get to play Darcy, you'll play Delver, and then you'll still play Daze Force of Will Expressive Iteration. The rest of the deck is still busted. You just don't get to play with Rags. Modern Pioneer, 0 changes. I was kind of hoping they would do something to the companion mechanic because Lurrus is basically omnipresent, but they didn't, so oh well, that's what we got. And then for all 6 of y'all playing Standard out there, I bet y'all are just giant piles of hype right now. There's no more Faceless Haven, there's no more Elrond's Epiphany, and there's no Divide by Zero. I understand Divide by Zero, but I like it as a card, so I'm going to be a little sad about that, but not really. Like, that card was also pretty much omnipresent in Standard, so from the little bit that I have played and digested, it's just, I don't know, it's not really a fun format to play. Like, there's a lot of mono white aggro, there's a lot of mono green aggro, and both of those things use Faceless Haven pretty relentlessly. There's also a combo with Faceless Haven and the Book of Exalted Deeds, where if you have a Faceless Haven and you turn it into an angel, then the Faceless Haven is not leaving the battlefield, so you just like can't lose the game, which is really a problem because most decks don't have access to land removal. So that was a huge problem, but now it looks like they've worked on solving that, which is nice. And Historic, you can't play Memory Lapse, but you already couldn't play Memory Lapse, so whatever. The card just went from suspended to being officially banned, and honestly, who gives a shit? But that's going to be the ban list updates. Legacy players, rejoice, sing, and still lose to Delver. Yo, so next up is, I think, a really important topic. And honestly, I'm not the voice who really should be saying this, or really even should have to say this. Not only am I not a member of a marginalized gender, I'm also not a, I guess, social commentary expert as far as the world of Magic is concerned. Like, you know, I just generally do strategy, but this needs talking about. And this is an article that's a couple of weeks old now, and it's called 5 Steps to Break Down Gender Barriers in MTG by Ms. Hayo Yu. And it's important. Like, we are not going to be the only people playing games, and this needs to be acknowledged because a lot of people who are not men simply don't feel welcome in the circle that is Magic the Gathering. And honestly, as a black magic player, that's something that kind of hits home because there are some environments in which I also don't feel comfortable. So I feel like this is something that needs talking about. So this is an article that Channel Fireball shared on January 7th. I definitely recommend reading this. And she breaks it down pretty thoroughly, talks about just the fact that women and other people of marginalized genders do not really feel as welcome as they should be in the magic community. And the first step here is just admitting that there is a problem in the first place. Once that's done, you can then work on understanding the causes as to why people would not feel welcome or why people are actively gatekeeping others from our community. And then from there, we can, work on rejecting helplessness and making people feel more welcome rather than kind of a, you can come if you want to. You should make people actively feel like they are welcome and part of the community. Next step is actively taking action, where you want to go out of your way to make people feel like this is going to be something that you want them to be part of. Otherwise, it's just going to be as male-centric as ever, and Magic is going to continue to have kind of a stereotype associated with it, and that, this game isn't for anybody who's not a man. This is the man's game, a man's world, etc. And we want more people playing Magic. We want to have people who are different from ourselves playing Magic. We want to have a good time with everybody, not just one subset of people. You don't want your entire group to just be one giant echo chamber. You'll never learn anything new that way. And this is, something that benefits everybody. So we can use those steps to just always look forward. And you'll see here, we've got a couple of kids playing, and that's going to be the future of Magic. We want little girls to feel just as welcome as little boys when playing this game. And definitely give this a read. This is a great article. It's not even a long read or anything either. So there's our PSA. Go to Channel Fireball and check this out, y'all. All right, and our last piece of big news here before getting into our gameplay is that Star City Game is completely revamping their content. And what they're going to be doing, the TLDR version, is that they are straight up not going to be supporting any of their strategy related content creators anymore, which I find to be really unfortunate because Star City Games was a lot of the forefront of competitive Magic before COVID hit. And they were a lot of the reason why Legacy, for example, is still a format to this day. If there were not all of these big Star City Games tournaments back in the day, I don't know that Legacy survives to where it is now. And it's a little sad to see them kind of sunsetting content creators as a whole. We know that there's going to be a lot of people who are looking for other ways to supplement their income, like Jerry Thompson and other people like that. And that's just not really going to be an avenue they have. So I don't know, any of y'all out there who might be in a position to sponsor some of these content creators, or anybody who is simply looking to digest content, this is going to be something that's pretty important because there's a lot of content that they shared that was pretty relevant. Like they had a lot of the Versus Live stuff. They had a lot of article writers. They had a lot of commentary, and just seeing everything moving away from the competitive circle as far as their stuff's concerned, even though they're only one store, it's a pretty huge deal. So I just wanted to speak for a little bit, and then this is going to be something that you can read on Star City Games' website as well, but just a little bit sad to see a bit of a really big change too, not even a small change. It's really sad to see that big of a change coming from this. I think COVID has obviously ruined a lot of things for a lot of people, and realistically, something hobby related is on the smaller end, but this did affect a lot of people, and a lot of people make their livelihoods talking about this game, so it's kind of sad to see so many people essentially put out of a job like this. So I don't know, best wishes to everybody who was in that circle, because it's a little sudden to see that they're not going to be continuing this, but I'm also pretty sad about it. So round one, we actually play against Rhinos, which is a pretty good deck, right? So if you check out the little blurb we've got in front of us here, we'll see that it uses a lot of instant speed interaction, and it does cascadey things, and they start controlling the game, and then they play a bunch of 4/4 Rhinos, and generally it sucks to be the opponent. Luckily for us, we do have a lot of great tools to make sure that Cascade is really hard to get away with. So we have copies of Thalia, Mausoleum Wanderer, Spell Queller. It's a great deck against these combo decks that are just trying to basically hit 1+1 and then try to make 10 instead of 2. So the fact that they're looking to resolve non-creature spell into non-creature spell generally bodes pretty well for us. However, our opponent happened to be a relatively well-known streamer, Giggy, and he's all over like Twitch and stuff like that. So if you're already aware of him, great. If not, I'll actually link to the channel in the description too, because I thought he was a cool kid. Didn't also know that he was somewhat local either, which was kind of cool. Anyway, a lot of good stuff really happens for us there because Rhinos itself is just really hard to resolve against spirits. Again, Mausoleum Wanderer, Thalia, Spell Queller all make that somewhat of a nightmare matchup. And then in our sideboard, as we mentioned before, we have copies of Lavinia Azorius Renegade, and those make it so that the card Crashing Footfalls straight up cannot resolve at all. We also have things like Force of Negation and the one of Mystical Dispute, making it so that while our opponent was a pretty skilled player, this is just something that's a bit of a nightmare matchup. It also didn't necessarily hurt that in games 2 and 3, I think they were, we were both stuck with relatively low amounts of land, and I ended up being able to draw out of it because my cards line up well against his cards, but he wasn't able to draw out of it because a 2-lander against Thalia is just kind of a nightmare. So we did get to win that round relatively easily, but, you know, good matchups are good. Onwards to round 2. Round 2, we played against Burn, which is one of the decks that, going into the event, I did expect, seeing as we have the 3 copies of Core Firewalker in our sideboard. And Burn is basically the same deck that it's been for the last 106 years. They play Eidolon and a Great Revel, they play Monastery Swift Spirit and Goblin Guide, they try to get you dead, etc., etc. This was actually relatively hard. We have access to Thalia and Spell Queller, making their life relatively miserable. And we actually won game 1 at 1 life. It was really difficult. We had to have a line where we Spell Quellered, I think, like a 3-mana Skewer to Critics because Thalia was on the table and made our opponent unable to double spell with really anything else. And we decided to ignore a couple of attacks from Eidolon while we had access to Vialing in Spell Queller, because we wanted them to take damage for casting their spells, even if they ended up, you know, not resolving against us. That's a line that I like to take fairly often, is if I'm ahead on mana or I have like Spell Quellers in hand to do things about their spells, then if their Eidolon and a Great Revel attacks, sometimes I'll just let it go through because their spells have the potential to hurt them more than me when I'm attacking for more than they are. So that happens fairly often, and we won game 1 because of that. In game 2, what ended up happening is we got like a cool Mausoleum Wanderer start. They played around Mausoleum Wanderer to Path to Exile my turn to Core Firewalker. And not only did that make it so that they had to take a turn off getting rid of the Firewalker, they also effectively discarded what could have been a burn spell in their hand, and they put me a mana up. So that ended up being really good for us because we got to take advantage of the skipped turn, if you will, untap, and immediately we're holding up Spell Queller plus something else. So that ended up being like a really efficient way for us to get to win that game, and we got to slide to a pretty easy 2-0. Good job us. So our round 3 opponent, I think this is the coolest deck I saw all tournament. Yeah, so they played a bunch of just Azorius Goodstuff, and honestly, this deck rocked pretty hard. From what I saw, there was a lot of like Memory Deluges. There was Esper Sentinel came down on turn 1, so that card is something that I always like. I enjoy almost any excuse to play Esper Sentinel, really, ever. The card's so good. They had Snapcasters, Counterspell, Solitude. There was a Stoneforge Mystic package in there. I don't know whether they had Spell Queller, but I definitely saw Teferi 3, and there was probably like 1 or 2 copies of Teferi 5 in this specific list. But there was just a bunch of really good, just blue and white cards, and honestly, that might be something I end up exploring, because I've seen obviously a bunch of blue-white control decks running around, and I've seen a bunch of good stuff decks running around, but never just a blue and white one. So I'm pretty excited to try something like this, especially if it gives me a reason to play Hall of the Storm Giants in Modern, because that's a card that I actively like, but it just costs way too much to activate in Spirits. So might be something we explore in the future, but for now, we did have, of course, still a pretty good matchup against this deck. So it just really stinks for that opponent, because, you know, if they try to do something like casting Solitude and using Solitude to hit a copy of our well, really any other creature, then we could just go ahead and rattle chains. We can flash in Drogskull to give hexproof. There's just so much we can do. We can tap Giver of Runes to give pro color, but that doesn't mean that we had a really, really easy time of it. In game one, we actually had to work really hard because our opponent had a Cauldron Complete on the table, and they also used an Archmage's Charm to steal our Giver of Runes. So that sucked because Giver of Runes does not give her self-protection. She can only protect others. And they ended up using the Giver of Runes to force through some blows with the Cauldron Complete. And we ended up winning game one, thank God, but we ended up winning it at 1 life again, just like we did with Burn. And game two was much easier though. Like a lot of our sideboard cards, we ended up putting in the Mystical Dispute, and that helped a lot because we actually saw it and it got the counter to Fairy 3. We kept Thalia in, and I'm pretty sure that did some solid work. And they, I think, didn't know the matchup too well because they also kept in the Esper Sentinels, and that was almost like a mulligan to 6 because Esper Sentinel has little to no text against us. So that could have been some unfamiliarity. That could have been some, I just don't have enough cards to take out for this matchup, so I got to leave something in, and they chose to leave in something cheap. But either way, it worked out pretty well for us. Our opponent played a really cool list, and yeah, let's go ahead and check out the rest of this. Yo, so we've gotten through a pretty good portion of today's video, and we're having a pretty good time today. To show your love, I'd like you to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and hit the little bell so you know when new videos come out, and read the video description. That's where you'll find all the good stuff, like today's deck list, contact information, and more. Speaking of more, we have a new Discord server. That link is in the video description too. We can talk about Magic or anything else. You'll find Patreon exclusive content, and you can submit your decks to be played on this channel. Thanks for listening and watching. Now let's get right back into it. Right, so in our round 4, we played against Jund, and Jund is usually a deck that we don't really have too many problems with because we have the combination of Giver of Runes, Thalia, and then everything else giving our creatures hexproof. So it's usually pretty good. Even with the combination of Urza Saga and Shadowspear, because that is especially annoying as a combo against us. Reason being, Urza Saga is already a good win con by itself. You get to make your land drop, you get constructs, and you get to search for Shadowspear, which the lifelink is pretty annoying against us because we usually win by dealing small chunks of damage at a time. But also, the fact that Shadowspear can let you ignore hexproof is really big against us in the Jund matchup. Usually, we don't care that much because Urza Saga decks usually have to choose between playing Urza Saga or playing removal, but Jund is the one deck that actually gets to play both, so that can get really annoying. Also, our specific Jund opponent here is pretty good, so if you've heard the name Josh Pelrine, that would be because he actually won a Legacy Open with Show and Tell, so this is a pretty competent player, one that we usually have to look out for. And in game 1, we did in fact lose to multiple Urza Sagas because that card's just really good, and we have really no say about it because we're not playing Spreading Seas, we're not playing enchantment removal or anything like that. In games 2 and 3, what we get to do is put in the 4th copy of Skyclave Apparition and 3 copies of Prismatic Ending. So if your opponent is looking to play a bunch of removal at you, you know, you're able to protect your own cards with things like Giver of Runes. Thalia makes them more expensive, including cards like Hooligan's Command. You also get to play things like Drogskull Captains and Rattle Chains, so that provided Shadowspear isn't out, you're just able to effectively ignore a lot of your removal. And that is a plan that works out pretty well when we're also able to play things like Skyclave Apparition and Prismatic Ending to make sure that we're not really getting bopped by these things. We also get to take out Aether Vial in this matchup because Aether Vial against a Thoughtseize deck is effectively a mulligan because it's not actually a, you know, it's not a threat of your own. You're just playing something that enables your threats. But when your opponent can discard your threats or remove them really easily, having -1 threat in your deck is pretty bad when you see it in a hand. So we wanted to take out all of the Aether Vials and instead just put in the Skyclave Apparition in for our 3 prismatic endings for 4 total spots. Really easy. And since our deck was more, you know, removal and threat heavy, and we didn't self-mulligan by playing Aether Vial against them, we were able to not necessarily work on card quality, but our cards match up better when we're able to play more of them, and that's what siding out Aether Vial let us do against Jund. So we did end up winning this matchup 2-1, but it was not a easy fought 2-1. Onward to the next round. So round 5 was against Yawg Combo. And Yawgmoth is actually a pretty hard matchup for Spirits, because the way that Yawgmoth works is that, you sacrifice a creature, maybe it has Undying, but either way, they get to both draw a card and put a -1 counter on a creature. Against a deck full of X1 creatures, that's a really strong effect. So you can just like mow down all of our little stuff like Mausoleum Wanderer, Rattle Chains. You only need 2 of those to get rid of something like Giver of Runes, and then the rest of our stuff is unprotected. So it's a pretty good matchup for them, unless you win a die roll, and that's what we did. In a die roll here, we got to go turn 1 Mausoleum Wanderer, turn 2 Supreme Phantom attack for 3, and since they were on the draw, the only cool thing they got to do was really just develop a couple of mana dorks, but by that point in time, we don't really care. So we got to just untap and go Mausoleum Wanderer into Supreme Phantom again, and now they're just stuck taking a bunch of damage. And by the time they were going to try to untap and cast a Yawgmoth, they had already died, because our next draw were the 3rd and 4th Supreme Phantoms. So yeah, our opponent died by a lot, and they had the Yawgmoth and Zulaport Cutthroat in hand, so they were going to be able to do some very cool stuff to us, but we never really gave them the chance. So we got to slide right into game 2, and in game 2, we ended up having access to just like a spell queller to lock out the Yawgmoth and stuff, and we got to have a Rattle Chains to make sure that we were able to ignore the first instance of a -1 counter when they got to re-Yawg, so this way they don't get to like unlock their stuff or use the proliferate ability, since we never let them put the first thing on there. And this matchup was kind of a stomp, even though we have a pretty bad matchup against a resolved Yawgmoth. But if Yawgmoth doesn't resolve, we don't care. So we just got to take that matchup and slide right into 5-0, so really good stuff for us. So round 6, we actually ended up having to play. So normally in a 7-round tournament, if you go 5-0, you're probably right on top of the brackets, and there's a good possibility that you'll be able to draw round 6 and draw round 7 and then just be completely safe to get into the playoffs. But we ended up having it so that there were only 3 undefeated players and 1 player who was still at 4-1. So I ended up actually having to play Magic. But we ended up playing against Affinity, which is also relatively hard. They're pretty fast. They have flyers of their own in Ornithopter and Thought Monitor, and we are generally just trying to do effectively the same thing, but slower, with the upside of being better against spells. So we ended up getting a relatively fast start though. Like, we had an Aether Vial on turn 2. We got to play a Giver of Runes off of the Aether Vial and flash in a Rattle Chains, and this is a matchup where just flashing a naked Rattle Chains is like completely fine, because they play little to no removal basically ever. Sometimes you can catch them playing off of the Urza Saga like an Aether Spellbomb, but that's usually the complete list of removal. They're just looking to kind of overwhelm you with their own plan. But Giver of Runes makes it so that even if they're doing the cool stuff with things like cranial plating, we are still pretty much okay, because we can always block the thing, and Giver of Runes will give protection from whatever color the thing was. So that's still pretty good times for us. And then we also have Skyclave Apparitions to help take care of things like Shadow Spear that they can get off of Urza Saga, or any of their lower cost creatures like, say, I don't know, Frogmites or something. We're able to get rid of all of that stuff with Skyclave Apparitions. So the other cool part about that is that, a decent chunk of their deck flies, but all of our deck flies. So anytime we're able to start getting to attack mode, it's really good for us. And if they try to go kind of tall with a cranial plating or a nettle cyst instead of wide with just a bunch of things and a signal pest, for example, then that's where Shacklegeist comes in. So we ended up getting to win game one, even though they were attacking for quite a bit. I think we actually ended up being at like 1 or 2 at this game's end. But in game two, we just get to take out the Thalias that are relatively useless, and we instead get to play to things like, excuse me, we get to play to things like the Prismatic Endings, we get to play to Forest Skyclave Apparition, and this matchup is pretty good when they're unable to resolve equipments, because what happens is they are stuck with a bunch of, 1/1s and 2/2s, but they don't play Lord effects like we do. So without Cranial Plating or Nettle Cyst on the table, their cards all just kind of suck, even if they see a lot of them with Thoughtcast and Thought Monitors. We, however, just get to play a bunch of higher quality creatures by virtue of having Lords in our deck. So they're able to basically do nothing, where we're able to just have a whole lot of power and toughness on the table. So we did get the 2-0 relatively easily, and now we get to handshake against what is now the only other, I guess, XO at the table, and one of the guys I've liked for a really long time, Steve Thompson. He is playing Amulet Titan with Cultivator Colossus. So we know that if we fight him in the playoffs, we've got our 3 copies of Subtlety to help take care of that matchup. So as much as I like my boy, I'm kind of hoping to see that matchup like, in top 8 or top 4. Ideally, we all just chop the top of the tournament and, high five each other, and everybody gets like $300 store credit apiece. But one of our opponents did actually want to play Magic, so there was no split possible. That means we're going into the playoffs. So here are the tournament standings after the round 6, but before round 7. So we've got 18 points here, and we're the only 6-0 in the room, letting you know that, hey, Spirits is a deck that can totally do it. And even though we fought against some really strong stuff and a couple of relatively bad matchups, we kind of cleaned up pretty nicely here. We got to just basically beat up on everything, and the configuration that we played this event happened to be exactly the right one. So like we played against, Rhinos, which is really powerful, Burn, which is great and has been all over the place forever, Jund with Saga, which is just, here's a bunch of powerful cards, good luck. We played against Affinity, which does the same thing we do, but faster. We played against Yawgmoth Combo, which can machine gun down our creatures, and we played against a bunch of blue-white good cards, which honestly, we're playing a bunch of blue-white subpar cards. So the fact that we're able to take our synergistic but subpar cards and beat up on a pile of really good cards bodes pretty well for us. So here we're guaranteed to be top 8. And if people actually want to play the top 8, we are guaranteed to be on the play for the entire top 8. So fingers crossed, and we can win at least one, if not the entire tournament, but at least one of our playoff games. So let's see what happens. So top 8 is here, and we are playing against Yawgmoth Combo again. So this is going to be one that is almost guaranteed to be better for us than it was in the Swiss, even though we won in the Swiss. Because remember, we got absurdly lucky in game 1 by drawing all 4 Supreme Phantoms, and we won the die roll. But this time in the playoffs, we don't have to worry about the die roll, because we're guaranteed to be on the play as the number 1 seed. We end up getting out a hand of Aether Vial with a Mausoleum Wanderer off the top, and this time we do see the combination of Rattle Chains into Drogskull Captain. We also have a Spell Queller in hand to lock down any potential casting of Yawgmoth. So we end up getting to use the Mausoleum Wanderer to counter a copy of Eldritch Evolution and stop our opponent from just doing the super cool things, and that gave us enough time to be able to untap and Spell Queller copies of Yawgmoth. So now we're getting to attack. Their Yawgmoth is kind of in jail from our Spell Queller, and we were able to make sure that we did not, face the wrath of everything cool that was happening there. Game 2, though, went a little bit differently and much better for our opponent. They got off to one of those really fast starts that included a Zulapor Cutthroat. And because of the Cutthroat being in play, that means that they were able to engage in combat a lot more aggressively. We're able to kind of control things for a little bit, but they do have the Draining Gain triggers every time something cool happens. Also, they had enough mana to use a Court of Calling for 1 as kind of like a pump fake spell, but my Mausoleum Wanderer was just small enough to make this kind of a problem, and I didn't want a Young Wolf to be on the table, which, they didn't have a Young Wolf on the table already. So I did spell Queller the Court of Calling for one, but that was immediately followed up by a Grist. And they actually didn't even try to kill the Spell Queller, because the way that works is Spell Queller will put the spell back on the stack, but it doesn't care about what the original value was. That means that the Court of Calling would have been for 0 anyway, and they didn't really worry too much about my 2/3 flyer. So what they did was take up the Grist instead. And a cool thing that my opponent found out, and I've actually never seen IRL happen either, so it was really cool all around. Grist milled a copy of Grist, and normally this is irrelevant because there's no other insects in the Yawgmoth deck. But when Grist copies or mills a Grist, Grist itself counts as an insect creature in the graveyard, triggering the Grists again. So my opponent actually got to double loyalty counter, double mill, and they got 2 insect tokens instead of just 1 for the 1 activation. So that was really cool. And because that was a thing that my opponent had never actually seen before, I thought it was pretty awesome. And I was like, whatever, here's a fist bump, my dude. That was really cool. So a lot of that advantages, when coupled with the Zulaport Cutthroat, did get them across the finish line, even though we were attacking for pretty decent chunks, but the life gain was a little much. So we ended up having to go to game 3. And in game 3, this was a lot of back and forth. They got to do a cool thing. They resolved the Yawgmoth. We got to draw a Rattle Chains to protect Spell Queller from Yawgmoth doing cool things to it. But what I did not consider is that Yawgmoth has the ability to, you know, discard to proliferate counters that are already on it. And I think my opponent really wanted me to put in Rattle Chains to protect the Spell Queller. What ended up happening was that Spell Queller already had a -1/-1 counter on it. And by the time I drew the Rattle Chains, it was too late to protect from the proliferate part of things. But what I wanted to do was protect from the sacrifice ability that Yawgmoth had used to give Spell Queller an additional counter spell. I'm sorry, an additional counter on it. And more importantly, on my end, I wanted to deny my opponent the card draw. So we did get to ignore the card draw part, but what they did do is, you know, proliferate a couple of times, get rid of the Spell Queller anyway, and just like free their cool shit. So I ended up just kind of being stuck dealing with it, right? Like I just kind of had to take that. And we did have to rebuild a little bit. Like we got to draw another Skyclave apparition to solve that Yawgmoth, and a Shacklegeist did pretty well at making sure Strangleroot Geist and or what's the other undying creature, Jelf's Messenger, didn't have the ability to attack. So we got to control the combat step just enough to make sure we're able to kind of cross that finish line, because otherwise, if they're able to resolve another Yawgmoth, then we might have just like died on the spot, you know. But also, we need to be attacking, and making sure that they can't attack back was kind of crucial. So we did exactly that. And we did manage to win the games. That means we're in top 4. And luckily for us, that means that we're going to be up at least $300 in store credit. So now we get to go into this next matchup on the play. Yo, so here we are in top 4, and we go ahead and, you know, I would say win a die roll, but we're guaranteed to be on the play. This time we are against Hammer Time, and this is one of the harder matchups in Modern because, again, they're like Affinity, doing a lot of the same stuff that we're doing. They're just doing it much faster, and like even faster than Affinity, which is like 4 or 5 orders of magnitude faster than we are. So we have a lot to kind of look out for here, and they can turn any Ornithopter into like a lethal attacker, so we just kind of need to be on our P's and Q's, right? Unfortunately for game 1, we were not really on our P's and Q's. So we get some attacks in, we get to do cool stuff, but one of the cards that we're looking for most is named Shacklegeist, and we do not see one. We also don't really get to see a Skyclave apparition, and when your opponents are like, you know, drawing cards with things like Pure Steel Paladin and attacking for 10 with the Colossus Hammers, it was not really a great time. We were kind of stuck being under the abyss, if you will. And you know, that's not really a great way to make sure that we win games, because, you know, just we need creatures to win. But when your opponent is forcing you to block every turn, then you're not keeping creatures on the table. Just a bad time all around. So we did lose game 1, and now we get to slide into game 2 though. Here we're able to take out Thalias, cards that are honestly relatively useless against a deck that plays everything for 0 and 1 anyway. And we get to put in Prismatic Endings and Skyclave Apparitions. I also like taking out 1 copy each of like Spell Queller and Giver of Runes, and putting in the 2 copies of Force and Negation. So this way we're more able to worry about their things like Sigarda's Aid and Colossus Hammer, and then we can just kind of get back to our regular plan of attacking. This works, and we're on to play with a relatively aggressive start, but more importantly, we were able to vial in a copy of Shacklegeist and make it so that their Colossus Hammer effectively has no text. And seeing as their deck is called Hammer Time, if we can mitigate that card's effectiveness, we're really able to win games. So we did take that game from them, and now we get to go into game 3. In game 3, they're on the play, which is already scary enough by itself, right? But we were both able to do cool combat things. So the thing from our opponent is that they actually saw multiple copies of Urza Saga. And again, that card is one that's really able to give us problems, seeing as we're not playing Spreading Seas or Enchantment Removal to get rid of the land itself. We are, however, playing Prismatic Endings. And what ends up happening is that we get into like a bunch of back and forth. They're attacking us with a couple of Urza Saga, a couple of Urza Saga construct tokens. Duh. I couldn't think of the word construct tokens, really, y'all? Please embarrass me in the comments. But they're attacking me, I'm getting beaten down, and I end up seeing a Shacklegeist, so we're able to get some attacks of our own back in. And I also have a Giver of Runes on the table, but I only have 1 to their 2 construct tokens. So what ends up happening turn after turn here is that they're attacking me, I'm able to block 1 creature, give it protection from colorless, so that the Urza Saga token doesn't really do anything, and end of turn, I'm able to use a Shacklegeist to tap down their flying blockers. This ensures that I get damage in a few turns here and there. Over the course of 1 turn, though, my opponent ends up seeing an Yawgmoth Nexus and uses it as a blocker for one of my 3/2 Rattle Chains. And this ends up mattering quite a bit, because what happens is on the final turn here, I'm at, I want to say 2, maybe 4, either way, much smaller than one of the constructs' power and toughness. And I only have a few creatures left on the table. So what ends up happening here is they see multiple Ornithopters, and I'm able to block just enough to have Shacklegeist activations available, and I end up being able to, well, rather 1 Shacklegeist activation available, and I tap down 1 Ornithopter, leaving them with another Ornithopter, and I go ahead and untap. Now I've all but guaranteed that I can go in and attack for a pretty sweet amount, because they were at 6. I go ahead and attack with everything but the Skyclave Apparition I had on the table and the Giver of Runes, because they only have the 1 Ornithopter. What I don't remember is that they go ahead and block my 3/2 Rattle Chains, and they let through my Mausoleum Wanderer, which was a 2/2, my Supreme Phantom, a 1/3, and my other Rattle Chains, which, if you remember, has a -1 counter on it now, thanks to the Yawgmoth Nexus having blocked it previously. That's only 5 damage. And I completely forgot about the die that was on my Rattle Chains. I thought it was 6 power, not 5, that was getting through. And the worst part about all of this is if I had simply given protection from colorless to my 3/2 Rattle Chains, we actually win that game. But I straight up forgot about this, and I let them block the 3/2, and they only took 5, and I lost that game. So that's going to be the end of our tournament. But we had a really good run of it, right? Like, again, we beat up on a bunch of really powerful decks, and even against the decks that did a lot of the same stuff we did, but faster, we either just beat them relatively cleanly, in the case of all the earlier rounds, or even in this round. We did have a route to victory, but to be honest, I punted it away, so, you know, it's what it is. But good stuff to all of our opponents, and that was a really cool tournament. So we're up $300 in store credit, so that's always nice in case we want to buy some stuff later on. Like, I don't know, that's almost 2 entire Pioneer decks sometimes, depending on what you build. Or that can be like a few legacy staples, like, I don't know, if you need things like Wastelands or Force of Wills, that's multiple good cards out of there, or like halfway up to a whole dual land. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with that. So I was pretty happy to turn our store credit, our entry into a pretty decent amount of store credit. That's always really nice, because who knows what people will need in the future. And a great time all around. Like, we got to play an IRL Magic tournament for, you know, only the second time in a couple of years, at least as far as bigger tournaments. I did play like one FNM. And we just had a really good time of it. Like, I enjoyed myself. We got to go outside, socialize with people who we haven't seen in a while. Big ups to Larger Than Life in Syracuse, New York, for actually making sure everybody kept their masks on. So that was really one of those things that was kind of comforting. I was kind of worried about how that would go, because the last IRL tournament I played, the reason I didn't show y'all any pictures of anything is because of the fact that we took a top 8 picture and I was literally the only person with a mask on. So I'm glad that this event was very different in that regard. I was a little uncomfortable after that first one. So they ended up taking care of that really well. So that's going to be our tournament run. And yeah, let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about the actual deck list itself that we went over earlier. Let me know what you think about any of the rounds and how cool the opposing decks were or anything like that. And let me know what you would change differently if you expected to fight the same field. Would you play the core Firewalkers even though we only played against Burn once? Would you play the Force of Negation or Sided In more often, because we only played against one real spell-based combo deck here? What would you do in this scenario? But if that's going to be everything here, I want y'all to go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I will see y'all on the next one.